Good evening, everyone. I welcome you all to the first session of 3D design. Today, we will be going through the basic user interface of a 3D software of choice, Blender. Then, we will also see how to make basic models using the object mode. Next slide, please. But next slide. But first, let's go through the process of inductions. There will be 4 sessions throughout the month of June, one every week. We will inform you prior to the sessions about the specific details. During the session, live demonstrations will be given and try to follow along. All queries will be resolved. Do not worry. After the sessions, we'll be providing you with a task that you have to complete by the given deadline. All tasks are compulsory and will affect your induction process. Now, I would like to invite Anav.
Thank you, Shrey. We at the 3D department of Exen Clan primarily use Blender 3D as a main software. Blender is a popular software for 3D designing. It is free and open source. Blender has a huge community support and has fast development. Now this is a default Blender splash screen. To start a new file, you can either click anywhere on the screen or you can click on General under New File. I'll just click over here. And now in a default Blender screen, you have 3 objects: a default cube, a light, and a camera. So there are 4 main ways of navigating in Blender. The first is rotating. Rotating the view can be done by pressing the middle mouse button and then dragging the mouse around to rotate in the 3-dimensional world. Now, if you're without the mouse, you can use the gizmo on the top right-hand corner of the screen and move the cursor to rotate. Next is panning. Panning the view in Blender can be performed similarly to orbiting, just with the addition of holding the Shift key. So this can be done by pressing Shift and the middle mouse button, and then we can just move the cursor along to pan. This way we are able to pan along in the screen. Now again, if you're without a mouse, you can press the hand button over here and then pan. Next is zooming. To zoom in or out, you can either scroll forward to zoom in or you can scroll backward to zoom out. The last is selection. In Blender, you can select objects by pressing the left mouse button. So for example, if I want to select the cube, I can just press on the cube using the left mouse button, and like this, I can select anything. Now we'll be looking at objects and object manipulation. In the 3D world, there are 3 axes. So there's the x-axis, which is a red colored line, the y-axis, which is a green colored line, and the z-axis, which is not shown as default, but is the blue colored line over here. So now we can align our view to any one axis by pressing any letter on the gizmo, which I already taught you before. So for example, if I want to align my view to the x-axis, I can press the x-axis, and now as you can see, I can see the z-axis and the y-axis. However, I cannot see the x-axis since I am directly on it. Similarly, I can press Z to align the view to the z-axis or Y to align the view to the y-axis. Now, if I press Y again, it gets us minus Y, which is 180 degrees opposite to Y. For example, if I just use a rough rotation, and if I rotate 180 degrees over here, you can see we roughly get Y. Now, many of you must be wondering if there are other objects in Blender besides the cube. The answer is yes. In Blender, we can add all the basic 3-dimensional shapes such as the cube, the sphere, the cone, the cylinder, etc. We can do this by pressing Shift A, and now we get the add menu. So we can go to mesh, and now we have a plethora of the basic 3-dimensional shapes used. So for example, I can add a sphere now. Now to delete objects, we can either press the X key and then press delete, or we can simply press the delete key on the keyboard. Now we get a sphere. Now again, I can add a torus. I can delete the sphere. Can get a cone. I can delete a torus, and so on. Now, some of you must be wondering why all the objects are added at the same point and I have to delete them after each turn. This is because of the location of the 3D cursor. The 3D cursor is a small red white colored circle which is the starting point of all objects. For example, if I select the cursor button over here on the left hand side and then press anywhere on the screen, for example over here. Now if I press Shift A and add a torus, the torus is automatically added over here, the new location of the 3D cursor. Now as I explained before, there are three axes in Blender and these axes are at 90 degrees to each other. There is the x-axis, which is the red colored one, and the x-axis represents forward backwards motion. Next is the y-axis or the green one, and this represents left right motion. And the last is the z-axis or the blue one, and this represents up and down motion. Now we'll be looking about movement of objects in Blender. In Blender, objects can be moved by pressing the G key. When I press G, the object is locked to the cursor and it will move in the direction of the mouse. Wherever I move my cursor in the screen, the object will move along. So if I want to move it over here, I can press left click and let it go, and the new position of the object is now fixed. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that by pressing G, we are enabling free movement. That is, a movement not restricted on any one axis. If you're not comfortable with all of these shortcuts, you can press the move button over here and then press this white circle to move. Now, how to move objects along one particular axis. Now, to move along a particular axis, we can press G and then the axis on which we want to move. For example, if we want to move on the x-axis, we can press X. And now it will only move on the x-axis as you can see on my screen. It does not move anywhere else. Similarly, I can press Y and it will only move on the y-axis. Again, I can press Z and it only moves on the z-axis. This way we can move objects anywhere we want in the 3D landscape. For example, I can move it on the x-axis, then I can move it on the y, and then I can move it on the z. Like this we can. Now, if we want extremely precise movements on a screen, we can add a particular digit for a movement. For example, if I want to move this torus, I can just left click to select it. And now I can just, if I want to move it on the x-axis, I want someone to write it in the chat box. How will I select it so it can move on the x-axis? Yeah, that's right. So it's G and then X. Now, if I want to move it by say 10 meters, so I can press 1, 0. And now it moves by 10, exactly 10 meters. I can say then G, Y, minus 7. It moves negatively by 7 meters, which is the bottom. Next is rotation. So the hotkey for rotation is R. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that rotation, location, that is movement, and scaling, all three have extremely same features, and the only difference between them is the shortcuts. For movement, as we discussed, the shortcut was G, and now for rotation, the shortcut is R. So now if we press R, again the rotation is locked to the cursor, and the cube and the cone rotates along our cursor. So I can just press left click to let go and finalize the rotation. Now again, if the shortcuts are not comfortable, you can press the R rotate button over here, select this white circle, and then move around to rotate. I know that these shortcuts might seem intimidating at first, but over time you'll all get the hang of it. Now again, to restrict the rotation along a particular axis, I can press any R and then the axis on which I want to snap it to. For example, R and Z. So this rotates only on the Z axis. Then R, Y. Now this only rotates on the Y axis, and then R, X. This only rotates on the X axis. Now if I want to rotate along a particular number of degrees, I can press R. Now if I want to rotate it on the Z axis, I can press Z and then 50. Now as you can see, it only rotates by 50 degrees. Next is scaling. Scaling is done by pressing the S key. Now by pressing the S key, we can scale either big or small. Now again, if you are not comfortable with the shortcuts, you can press the scale button over here and then scale it. You can use these buttons if you want, however, it's always recommended and best if you use the shortcuts. Now again, to scale along a particular axis, you can press S and then X. By pressing S, X, it scales on the X axis as you can see. Then S, Y, scales on the Y axis. Now again, how to scale on the Z axis? I want someone to type it in the chat box. Yeah, that's right, by pressing S and Z. Now one thing to keep in mind is that if I just add a cube, now if I want to scale it on two axes, but not on the third axis, I can press S, Shift, and the axis on which I don't want to scale. So if I want to scale it on the X axis and the Y axis, but not on the Z axis, I can press S, Shift, Z. And now it does not scale on the Z axis, only on the X axis and the Y axis. This holds true for movement also. So if I add a cube now, and now if I press D, Shift Z, it only moves on the Y axis and the X axis. Now if I want to scale along a particular amount of size, then I can press S, the axis, for example, say X, and then say 4. Now this scales by 4 units on the X axis. Now if you can press S, Y, 6, it scales by 6 units on the Y axis. Now I'll be handing it over to Garv to explain basic modeling using primitive meshes in Blender.
Uh, Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Gav. In this segment of the workshop, we'll be learning how to model using the basic primitive meshes that are the spaces in 3D space offered by Blender. Now I'll be replicating a low poly building by just using primitive objects. Try and follow along using the skills we have just learned. If you're unable to follow along, pause the recording of the session which we will upload later and go along at your own pace. So I'll just close my screen. If you have any doubts during this section, please do mention them in the chat box or the Q&A section. So first, we will start by deleting everything we have in a scene by selecting all of them and pressing X and delete. Now, we'll begin by adding a plane for the ground and scaling it up by press by S and 5. Let's do this. And next, we will add a cube for the base mesh of our building. We'll view it from the y-axis and just move it a little bit up to the x and move it on the z-axis and scale it and scale it on the z-axis by pressing S, Z, and think this much will do, and then we can move it up to align with the plane. Next, we will scale it on the y-axis by pressing S, Y, and just doing this, and a little bit on the x-axis also. Now, to make a copy of this mesh for the other side, we will press Shift D, which will duplicate this. So just select it, press Shift D, and move it on the x-axis, just like that. And then we will duplicate this mesh again by pressing Shift D, X, and moving it to the center. So we have 3 cubes now in a scene, and we can start by scaling down the center cube a bit by on the Z axis first by S, Z, and just a little, and move it a little bit upwards. So think this will do, yes. And then we will scale it on the Y also. And then move these a little bit closer to the x-axis like this. and this one also. Yeah, I think this will do. And now we can join all three of them into one mesh by just selecting all of them and pressing Ctrl J. So this is a single mesh now. Now we'll move on to, now our base mesh is ready and we'll move on to the other details. So first we'll add another cube, move it a little back on the y-axis, move it up and scale it on the x, just like this. Cover the portion. I think this will do. Yes, this will do. And now we can move on to the details for the roof of our building. So just move the 3D. You can move the 3D cursor in your scene by just holding down shift and right clicking. So for now we will place 3D cursor here because we want to add our object on this point. So shift A and add a cube. Now we can just scale it down a little bit, match reference and scale it on the X. Yeah, this will do. So now we'll duplicate this one by pressing Shift D and rotate it on the Z axis at an angle of 90 degrees. So R, Z and 90 to rotate it at an angle of 90 degrees. And as you can see, this object has been rotated at an angle of 90 degrees. So we can move it up here and just scale it down to match the base mesh. Yeah, I think no, it's a little bit. This will do. So now duplicate this for the other side and move it on the X, just like that. And now we are going to duplicate this again by Shift D and move it to the X axis and moving it to the Y like this and just scaling it on the X again. So and move it on the Y, just like this. And then we'll duplicate the same mesh for the other side. So this portion of our roof is done. So now we can select all of the cubes that have been added here by holding down shift and clicking. So as to select all of them at once. And then we can duplicate these by pressing Shift D and moving it to the y-axis. And now we can rotate them like by pressing R, X, and at an angle of 180 degrees this time. So yeah, and just place them here. Yes. And now let's duplicate this one for the other sides and move it on the Y and rotate it on the Z axis at an angle of 90 degrees by just typing 90 on a keyboard and move it here. And we can scale it to match the other ones. I think it's going to be good. And let's, that's perfect. And just duplicate it for the other side also. Yeah. So the details for our roof is done. And then we can select all of these meshes by holding down shift as I had mentioned before. And press Ctrl J to like join all these meshes into one. So Ctrl plus J. And all of these will now be joined into one mesh. Now we can move on to making the windows. So first, I will switch to the y-axis by pressing, just clicking over here, pressing number pad 1 on my keyboard. Both do the same, and just move the 3D cursor over here by shift and right clicking, and add a plane. And you can just move it a little bit, rotate it on the x-axis by an angle of 90 degrees, and scale it down. just like this, and move it a little bit outwards. Yeah, this will do. And now we'll add a cube for the rims and just scale it down. Move it on the Y, move it from here, and scale it to match the size of the window. Just now we can duplicate this for the others, just like this. And now we can select both of them and duplicate them at the same time and rotate them on the y-axis at an angle of 90 degrees. Yes, this will do. And just scale them a little bit down and select these individually and move them. Yeah. Yes, this works. So, and we can duplicate it just again. So with this, the basic details of the window is complete. And then we can just select all of these once again and hit Control J to join all of them. And then we can duplicate this window to make like multiple copies of 3 on this side. Then I'm gonna select all of these and press Shift B and move it to the other side. And I think it's just a little bit too much. So yeah, this will do. So our building is more or less complete. We just have to add another cube at the end to make the entrance. So just move it over here and move it a little bit on the Y and scale it on the Y also. Just move it. Yeah. So with this, our building is complete, and we have also come to the end of today's session. If you have any queries, please do mention them in the chat box or the Q&A section. Thanks a lot.
Okay, before everyone leaves, we also have a task for you, but we will be sharing that doc with you later on, nearly in the evening or so. So please be active in the Google Classroom and see the task. Thank you.